Hello, and welcome to the Santee Church of Christ Bible Study Rewind and Review, where we look at the last class that we had on Sunday morning at 9 o'clock at the building. We also have another class on Wednesday nights. We meet at 7 o'clock for that. This class is Deuteronomy. We are currently, we finished up Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we got into chapter 23 a little bit. So, in this part of chapter 22, we're covering verses 13 through 30. Now, some of it we covered the previous week, so I won't get into that part. So, just as a reminder, if you read the text first, and I'll review what we talked about briefly, not everything, but I'll briefly go over what the text is about, and then you'll be caught up. You'll be caught up to the class. So, in those verses, it basically covers it's not just about sexual activity and that sort of thing. It's mostly about marriage. It's about the God-given sanctification of a marriage, and its protection of women, and its protection of that vow, where you have multiple families, two families, being joined together through a marriage. It isn't like today where, we think in the Western world that romantic love is the drive behind marriage. That's not the case, and that's not the case in a lot of the world. A lot of it has to do with the joining of families, the joining of resources, and that sort of thing. So it's nothing like how we see this romanticized idea of marriage. And not that there wasn't any romance in marriages back then, but we have to understand that love was very much an action that a person decided to perform to fulfill the vow of marriage. So, without getting too deep into it, so these were some of the laws that we talked about. If a man is caught sexually with a married woman, they are both to be executed. This was adultery. When a woman is betrothed, in other words, when a woman is betrothed, she's basically married. They've made the promises, the two families have made the promises, and so she's basically married. And she lives in the city. If a man takes her sexually and she complies willingly, they are both to be executed, because that's essentially adultery as well. If a man takes a betrothed woman sexually in a field outside the city, the man is to be executed, since even though she may have cried out, there was no one to help. So those two instances they use different words, and one in the instance of a woman being taken in the field, this is an assault. This is not something that she is complicit to. We have to understand this, because nowadays we see a lot of people accusing God of condoning assault, and that's just not true. If a man finds an unbetrothed woman, in other words, she's not married, and takes her sexually, he shall give her father 50 pieces of silver and shall be his wife, and he cannot ever put her away. So we have to understand, again, people accuse God of condoning. It's basically saying if a man assaults a woman, she has to marry him. Well, in this instance, it's the same thing. It doesn't mean he takes her by force. He basically seduces her, and she is willing in this union in that sense. And so these are instances where people are overcome by their own passions, and God is saying, you're not going to just do this and then walk away from this woman, because she, as we've seen earlier, if a woman is found to have been sexually active before a marriage, and it's expected that she isn't, she can get in gigantic big trouble. So this is a protection for that woman, and we have to understand this. This isn't like today. Okay, these days are not like today, and women don't have a lot of rights like we realize today. And so God is protecting the rest of this woman's life, where this man has to marry her, and he cannot leave her. He cannot, push her out of the house. Okay, so in chapter 23, we didn't get very far. And that was probably my fault. I kind of went off on a tangent and I led everybody down a rabbit hole, and I think I probably lost a bunch of people. It's pretty dark down in that rabbit hole sometimes. But in chapter 23, there's a part where it talks about people who cannot join the assembly of Israel. And there are a lot of arguments about what that means exactly. It could mean you can't worship with them. Or it could also mean, and it very well does mean, that you cannot call yourself part of Israel. In other words, in this sense, the instance that I got really hung up on this was an illegitimate child cannot call himself. He cannot enter the assembly until the 10th generation after him, including him, of course. So what does that mean exactly? It looks from the outside, a person who doesn't understand what God's trying to do here would say, that's just terrible. How is it that a person who has no control over how they're born be excluded from the Israelites? Well, it doesn't mean that they will not, that they lose their inheritance rights. That's not what that means. What it simply, I think what God is trying to do here, part of that law means there's a couple of ways of looking at it. Either it's two people who cannot legally be married. If they have a child, that child is considered illegitimate. And in another instance, and this was something that I read many places. It was if a person who is not an Israelite marries an Israelite husband, that child is considered illegitimate and is not to be considered to be counted as an Israelite. That was another way to look at it, and that is seemingly has a lot more ramifications, because this entire time we've been reading this book, God has been telling them, you are not to commit idolatry. And we have to remember that when a person marries somebody who's not of the Israelite people, that's bringing in a different God into the household. That's the way it is. We saw Jacob do it with Rachel, and these things are problematic. God does not want the child of that mother to be counted as an Israelite, because he may be a bad influence as far as leading them astray from God. And there are other instances where, of course, where if you have two people that aren't married that have a child as well. The rabbit hole that I went down was when you look at David's lineage. Judah and Tamar were not supposed to be married, although she tricks him into making her pregnant. And so perhaps Perez may be considered illegitimate. But it's 10 generations later that you see David come along. And after 10 generations, technically he could be called an Israelite. The issue is, and I didn't bring this up, but the issue is that Boaz, who is in that lineage, and he's okay, he's an Israelite, marries a Moabite woman. So I think the overriding message there is that God is not under this law. He's the one that chose David. And it's more important to recognize that these non-Israelite people who are included in the Christ lineage, Jesus lineage, shows us and foreshadows the inclusion of the Gentiles. That's the broader spectrum of what God's doing here. That's as far as we got. So thank you for listening. If you want to join us anytime for Bible study, we'd love to have you. You can find our information online at either our website or our YouTube or our Facebook pages. Thank you. Thank you for listening again, and hope to see you. May God bless you. Thank you.